Well, maybe we shouldn't have been surprised that an administration basically gave birth to the term alternative facts would now paint a picture of its border policy that seems to be in direct conflict with basic and evident truths. Our senior political correspondent Andrew Whitman is here with the very latest on the family separation policy. And Andrew, every time I think, as bad as it is, it can't get any worse, and finally they'll own it, somehow, some way, they actually do. They make it worse.
There's the policy and there's the sort of dual speak that seems to accompany any explanation of the policy, Rich. And let's start with the images that everyone in America has now seen. Immigrant children separated from their families and locked in cages at detention centers. Now compare what you see to what Homeland Security Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen said while testifying before a House committee yesterday.
Just yes or no, are we still putting children in cages?
To my knowledge, CBP never purposely put a child in a cage if you mean a cage like this.
Purposely or whatever, are we putting children in cages as of today?
Children are processed at the border facility stations that you've been at. Some of them.
And I've seen the cages. I just want you to admit that the cages exist.
Sir, they're not cages.
You saw the pictures. You tell me, are they cages or not? So the secretary wouldn't admit the kids have in fact been put in cages. She also refused to say that the policy she implemented actually separated families. Instead, she said this.
The AG memo that was issued directed all U.S. attorney offices along the southwest border to prosecute all adults who were referred for prosecution. That's what it did.
That's a policy.
But
that is a policy.
Not as you described it.
Madam Secretary, that is a policy. When you knew that that policy was going to result in children having to be taken away from their parents. That's a policy. You should admit it.
It was the voice of Long Island Congresswoman Kathleen Rice you just heard. Not much from the secretary over reports that more than 4,500 separated children have complained about sexual abuse while in government custody, or that 178 of those complaints were aimed directly at Justice Department employees. The closest Nielsen got was to say that the government now performs pregnancy tests on girls as young as 10 years old. Then came the question of whether parents are being given a chance to reunite with their separated kids if they agree to be deported. Here's the secretary yesterday.
There was no parent who has been deported, to my knowledge, without multiple opportunities to take their children with them.
But at almost the same time she said that, the Trump administration admitted in a court filing yesterday that 471 immigrant parents were deported without first giving them the option to reunify, in direct contrast to what Nielsen said. And all this as horror stories from the border continue to roll in, including the stories like this: a Honduran father and daughter who claimed asylum in the U.S., but who were lied to repeatedly by ICE agents who took the 16-year-old girl to Arizona and the father to Texas with no way of contacting one another. Both are now living together near Los Angeles. And a few minutes ago, I spoke about this with Steph Kite. She's a reporter for Axios who covers immigration. Steph, busy times for you covering the border. So many stories in the news, allegations of kids being sexually assaulted, the numbers in the thousands of those allegations, parents not being given the chance to reunite before departing. Numbers altogether still way up. Not clear how many kids have been separated or where they are or if they'll be returned. You and I are both reporters, but we can also be impacted by the stories we cover. I'm curious, which of the stories or angles has surprised or affected you the most in recent weeks?
That's a really good question. You know, immigration in general as a topic tends to be a very emotional subject. It's politically charged, but also dealing with real people, real lives, people who have oftentimes fled really serious environments in their home countries, and the situations are often so bad that they're willing to take these very dangerous journeys and willing to face even the prospect of family separation, which is additionally heartbreaking and difficult. So I think it's been interesting and sad to watch the impact of that, the trauma that many of these kids will carry with them for the rest of their lives. These events aren't things that just have an immediate impact, but often a lasting impact, especially when you're dealing with young children.
It's a great point that so many people are still willing to go through so much just for the chance of becoming an American. I know you've done some reporting on those sex assault complaints, some against Justice Department employees, most in shelters run by contractors. I'm curious, is there any process in place to help the alleged victims or investigate the claims or seek justice?
So there are certainly processes in place, and it becomes very complex, of course. So when children are caught crossing the border, this is anyone under the age of 18, when they're caught crossing the border illegally, they're apprehended by DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, by Border Patrol agents, and they then quickly transfer minors to Health and Human Services, who then place them in one of these shelters that are run by nonprofit contractors that often make hundreds of millions of dollars of government funds every year to take care of these children. And because this is run in part by the government, because Health and Human Services have a play in this, they do have policies when it comes to reporting these cases of sexual abuse. And so, to be clear, many of the people I talked to from these shelters, from these companies, would say that they over-report these allegations, that whenever there is anything questionable or anything that would raise awareness to the fact that maybe a child and an adult are too close together, or maybe something happened between two kids, or a shower door was opened, they report all of these instances. And so that is one of the reasons why we see these allegations in such high numbers. But on the other end of it, the fact that we are seeing so many of these allegations, whether or not all of them are actually warranted or not, really speaks to the fact that these shelters often operate without much oversight. I think that's what we're seeing people's attention being drawn to, and why we're seeing Senate members now calling for HHS to look into what went on in these shelters.
I'm sure you monitored Secretary Nielsen's testimony before the House yesterday. She wouldn't say that kids are being kept in cages. She wouldn't even agree that the administration's policy separated kids. She sort of relied on the "we're just prosecuting the adults and this is what happens" angle. Is it clear from your reporting what the truth is on those two subjects?
You know, there are policies that have been in place that would allow for some family separation. And this is something that Secretary Nielsen has used and kind of worded the way that the Trump administration has changed policies to her benefit. So during the Obama administration, for example, there were certainly some cases where families would have been separated. But I've spoken to former DHS officials who were working at the agency during that time, and these are very rare and special circumstances. And really the difference really was the zero tolerance policy, the fact that then Attorney General Jeff Sessions decided to prosecute any immigrant who came across the border illegally, then led to DHS then separating these families. And so whichever way Secretary Nielsen decides to explain it, it is true that actions under the Trump administration caused the family separation crisis we saw last spring, and there's really no way to get around that.
Final question, Steph, back to family separations. The government at last check was still resisting calls to locate, count, and reunite kids with their families. Is there any sense that the government is doing more on those fronts?
You know, last year, shortly after the president asked that the family separation policy be ended and that families be reunited, there were several weeks where DHS and HHS worked to reunite parents with their children. And it is important to remember that they were able to reunite the majority of them. There are, of course, some who have not been reunited, as you said. Some parents were deported before they had the chance to be reunited with their children. And it does not seem, based on what Secretary Nielsen said in her hearing, it does not seem like they are making those a huge priority, that most of the parents, they claim, were given the opportunity to be reunited with their kids and chose not to, and that is certainly a course that some parents would potentially take if they felt like their children had a better chance in the U.S. But like I said in the beginning of this interview, that the family separation policy has long-lasting impacts, and I think we're going to see this continue to be an issue, and the government continue to have to grapple with the fact that they have separated these families, that there are legal claims that are being filed that would require payment of damages for these families who have suffered so much. So this continues to be an important topic that we'll have to see how it evolves over the next few months.
Steph Kite is a reporter with Axios on the immigration beat, and a busy beat it is. Steph, thanks for a few minutes. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, Andrew, thank you very much. We'll continue to follow these family separations. Now, when we come back, Andrew is going to stick around. We're going to take a look at some of the headlines out of D.C., including former White House Chief of Staff John Kelly's surprising comments about his former boss and his boss's love of the wall. Kelly, he's gone, and he's not holding back.